Welcome back, everybody. This is Tom with Charlees Props, and we're here to talk about soldering on pixels. Now, you might be thinking, hey, you guys only make props with 50 pixel derivative props, so what gives? Why would I need to solder pixels? Well, actually, this is our piece stake star. It only has 25 pixels. You might need to cut, put a different end on it, or you might just want to make extensions between some piece stake stars. Maybe you've got a window outline that's not exactly 50. Maybe your manufacturer of the pixels that you get, maybe if you've got one pixel that's bad, they'd rather have you replace the one than pull all 50 and replace them. Either way, it's a good idea to have an understanding of how you're going to replace the pixels and which way you're going to do it. I generally prefer soldering the pixels. There's lots of products on the market where you don't have to solder, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to get into what has worked best for me, both mechanically and electrically, so let's get to it. So first things first, what do you need? Now, I like to use diagonal cutters. This is a set of little clips. I've got electrical tape at the end to help keep it from getting into the insulation of the wiring. It's not necessary. You're going to need some solder. You can get different types of solder online. And then I always suggest 3-to-1 heat shrink tubing with adhesive. Now with adhesive, what that does, that's got a glue lining on the inside. It's okay that it's much bigger than the wire itself because this 3-to-1 is going to shrink down really small, but the glue itself is what helps really make it weatherproof, watertight. And then you're going to need a heat gun to get that heat shrink tubing to reduce down in size once you've got everything done. And then you're going to need either something like this, which is an industrial sized soldering gun, or you're going to need a soldering iron. Now, these are sort of the two very extreme ends of what you could be using for this. I prefer the soldering gun to this, in part because it's much faster, and the way that I do it, I just need a quick amount of heat to it. This applies that really, really quick, really, really well. Now, I've also had soldering irons that are like this that have the adjustable temperature. They're great for certain projects. I do find that it takes a significant more amount of time as you get thicker in the wiring gauge. Maybe this would be okay for 5-volt pixels that have like 22 gauge wire on it, but it's still going to be quite a bit slower. We're going to get, and I'm going to show you that with the soldering gun and why I use it. Now this is kind of like using a sledgehammer to drive in, you know, a 2 or 3 inch nail. It's way overkill, but at the same time, this is kind of like a teeny tiny little toy hammer trying to nail in that hammer or that nail. Eventually that little hammer is going to get it in, but it's going to take a lot longer. It might be a little more frustrating. Whereas a sledgehammer is going to be way overkill. It'll get the job done. But you also have to be a little bit careful if you've got much, much smaller wire or really small intricate areas. This is going to be much more difficult to use. So let's get to soldering. Okay, so what we have here is this star stake is already pushed. This was an extra strand of pixels that I had. And if you notice, there's 25 in here, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 extras here. I don't need those, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the extra off right here. Now, if I wanted to, I could run an extension, and maybe we'll do that later in this video. I'll run an extension from the end of this pixel to the last pixel from this one, and then to the first pixel of this one. But if you notice over here, this is also 25. It's just our shorter version, and it has 3 holes left, but only 1 pixel left. So again, I'm going to cut this pixel here. Now, of course, we know that this is data in, this is data out. Now, if you're not aware of this, on one side, it's almost always going to be labeled on the inside. Some pixels have an arrow on this side that goes up this way. Sometimes the arrow goes this way. What you want to really know is what's the inside, what's the outside for data in and data out. So if you see the arrow on the back side and it's pointing down, what it's saying is that your data is going in on this side of the chip and then out on this side of the chip. So the other thing I didn't mention that's really handy to have is a set of auto stripper wire strippers. And the reason I like using those instead of the individual strippers that you could have is because you can put all 3 in at once and strip them at once. Now notice that I've left a good amount, somewhere around a 1/2 inch or so of extra wire there. That's because what I'm going to do is once I get some heat shrink tubing on these. For the 2 pixels that I'm going to add on to here, I'm going to twist them together, and then I'm going to solder those together just like that. Okay, so now I've got my 2 extra pixels here. I've done the exact same thing. I've stripped them back, pulled the wires apart. I'm going to make sure that the wire colors match appropriately. And let's see, the line is on the ground side of this one. And on this set, the line has the ground on it. I've also already pre-cut my 3 pieces of heat shrink tubing. They're going to be around 3/4 of an inch to an inch. And you want to make sure that you have enough room to basically cover twice as much of the amount of wire that you've left exposed. And I'll show you why here. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. I like to pop these on all at once. Sometimes they fall off, so you got to be careful if you do that. So I won't do that to make sure that we don't lose anything here. Now again, ground is on this side. It should be the marked side. And it is. So what I do is I take the 2 ends here. Notice that I'm holding them together, and what I'm going to do is kind of like a twist tie. I'm going to twist them together. And one way that I really find is useful is do one, and then that will sort of mechanically hold it. Now at this point I can kind of let go. I wouldn't suggest just closing it up because that's going to help mechanically hold it together. But really what you want is for the solder to flow in. So one mistake that you see a lot of people do, whether they're using a soldering gun or a soldering iron, is they will touch the tip of the soldering to the wire and then they'll touch the tip of the solder. What you really want to do is have the solder flow into the wire itself and get really in between the wire, because if you're just adding the tip and then adding the solder and you're just kind of coating the outside of it. That's not what we want. Now this is not preheated or anything of that nature. Now I'm going to start to kind of hold this to preheat it for just a few seconds here. And once it's sort of preheated a little bit the first time, if you're doing other wires, you really don't need to preheat that long. But you'll see how quickly this is. And I hold it here. Now what I tend to do when it's cold is start like this, but notice that I'm holding the solder towards the back here. Pushing up into the wire, because what's happening is, if you notice up close, it still looks like twisted wire there. That's because all the solder has actually gone in between the wire and it's holding that wire together. That's still pretty warm actually. Okay, so then I would do the next 2 wires, middle and middle, and then the outer 2 wires as well. So let's get the shrink tubing on there. Now it's okay if the shrink tubing kind of comes close to the end. What you don't want to do really is make sure that you're not hitting the shrink tubing with your soldering iron or your soldered gun. That's part of why I like the soldered gun, is you saw how quick that actually went. With a soldering iron, we might still be waiting here, waiting for it to heat up and then waiting for it to heat the wire up. Again, part of the problem with the soldering iron is that it ends up causing you to have to wait a bit longer, and instead of waiting, you touch it to the complete tip and then just hold at the tip and then drag the tip back and forth trying to get that coating of solder on the outside. But what's different here is, again, sometimes I do touch it like this, but the difference is as I add solder here, you notice that I'm not putting it in at the end, I'm dragging along the wire. The wire itself has heated up enough that, let's see if I can do it on this one here. Yep, there we go. We've already started melting the solder before the tip's even on it. Now at this point, these 3 are soldered. If you want to, you may want to double check that you've got them connected properly. That's up to you. What I do at this point, and it might help to have some pliers, especially if they're still hot, is I leave them just like this. And what I do is I fold it over like this right here, so that when the shrink tube goes over it, it's covering the exposed end and then the end that you just soldered over. Now why do I do that? Now these ones are a little bit longer, and so if they are a little bit longer, you can just take a pair of diagonal cutters like this and cut them down just a little bit. You don't want to cut too much because you still want them to mechanically hold, meaning you still want them to have enough strength to hold if there was something to happen to these for some reason, that it's not going to be a weak point. So shrink tubing goes in, covers it entirely like this. Now, if you have a heat gun like this, you do also want to be careful that you're not completely dousing your pixels in heat. And it's going to get a little bit noisy, and you're going to see here that I'm going to go back and forth and watch the heat shrink tubing as it shrinks down. Now, as this is going, I can tell that the glue is starting to stick a little bit. And you can see here as it shrinks down, the shiny part inside, if you can see that on camera, which I'm not sure, the shiny part is the glue itself. And I like to see that the glue comes out. That way it tells me that the entire heat shrink has taken place, and that the glue coming out means that it's now waterproof and weatherproof. Now I'm telling you, this is just as strong, if not stronger, than something like this. I hope you guys found that useful. The best way that I have found for soldering pixels after several years of doing this, I've soldered many different things. I've seen a lot of different people solder these a lot of different ways. This seems to be the best that works in all climates for soldering, and it gives a nice strong joint. Doesn't require any extra hot glue that I've seen other methods use, but it gives a nice strong joint where if something were to happen, it's not going to let go. Those wires are bound together, they're soldered together, and then they're glued together. Weatherproof, watertight, good connection. Thanks for watching. See you soon.